Hello, my name is Lauren Reeg. I work for the Rocky Mountain Institute, where I mostly focus on building sector decarbonization, specifically in the Midwest region, and then I also do a lot of work on federal funding and policy, which is what we're here to talk about today. The Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IRA and IIJA, as we'll refer to them today. Today, we're going to talk about the big picture impacts of these bills. We're going to follow it up by getting into the weeds about a couple sectors and how they can impact Wisconsin. And then we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. So let's talk about the big picture. These bills are historical investment in federal funding in both the energy and the climate space. The Inflation Reduction Act alone is bigger than any other investment we've seen in any other period, but together, they're massive. And that massive investment is going to have a really big impact on our climate targets and the energy sector as a whole. Without these bills, with our frozen policy before they were passed, the United States was not going to be even close to meeting our 2030 carbon goals that the US had set. With both the infrastructure bill and the inflation bill, we're expected to meet our 2030 goals by 2035, which, although not meeting them, is a huge, huge difference to what it was going to be, which is really awesome. But it also shows that there's room for improvement. How we implement these bills and what we work on at the state and local level to supplement them will really prove whether we can meet our climate goals and whether we can transform the energy sector into a clean, affordable place for everyone. So let's talk about how we're going to make that strategy change. Really, what these investments and these bills do is drive down costs in the clean energy sector compared to the fossil fuel sector. It makes clean electricity, electric vehicles, and heat pumps and electric appliances cheaper than alternative solutions. And it's driving onshore supply chains, meaning it's driving American jobs. So I want to talk about three of the major sectors: the electricity sector, the building sector, and the transportation sector, because those are three key areas that are going to impact the state that are funded by these bills. So we'll start with the electricity sector. We're seeing a lot of funding in tax credits and grants. There are tax credits for residential renewables, low-income community renewables, commercial and utility scale renewables. So we're going to see a lot of driving from the solar and wind sector in order to drive upfront costs down in order to make sure that these projects are built out. In addition, for grants, we're seeing investments in rural and tribal electric infrastructure, a lot of money going toward renewable workforce, and a lot of money going toward school upgrades. Now, there's some really key opportunities here. There's targeted funding in key communities, meaning the communities that need this funding the most have specific call-outs so that they can have access to this funding too. It also has a huge opportunity to expand the renewable workforce, not just in manufacturing, but in contracting and installation, which drives local Wisconsin jobs. There are some risks, though. This funding could be used to invest in projects that are not aligned with the state's climate and energy goals or affordability goals. And it is possible that if we aren't implementing this bill well and making sure the funds that are allocated to disadvantaged communities is used effectively, that these communities could still be left behind. But overall, the electricity sector got a ton of money, and it's going to be really exciting to see how that pans out. So I've talked about what's in the bill, but what are people using this bill for? I'm hoping to use these slides to kind of share what are other states doing, and so we can kind of learn some lessons from what other states have done well, what other states are not doing well, and so that Wisconsin can use those lessons learned to be effective. So we'll start with our neighbors. In Minnesota, they're using some funds to put solar on small businesses and helping support that, so to drive down their operational costs so that they are more successful as small businesses, but also using clean energy. They're also putting about $400 million in transmission upgrades, especially in communities that have historically not had great electric infrastructure. In Illinois, they're building off their existing workforce programs to supplement with more funds to build out their solar training. And particularly, this could be shared in Wisconsin. The agriculture industry is doing a lot of efficiency and renewable projects. In Colorado, we're seeing that they are investing in the workforce by expanding battery storage manufacturing. And they're also looking to stack funds. So they're blending residential solar credit, the tax credit from the Inflation Reduction Act, with existing state funding to drive down initial cost even more so that more people can afford it and put solar on their homes. And then in California, we're seeing a lot of work from the local tribes to do microgrid resilience projects for their communities. And then finally, given the tax credits at the residential, commercial, and utility sector, we're going to see solar and wind projects built at every scale in every state using these funds. Now that we've talked about the electricity sector, let's talk about the building sector, which is the sector I work most closely with and is my baby. So we're going to talk about two groups that are impacted. First are the owners, so the residential and commercial owners. They're going to receive tax credits for heat pumps, for building or owning new efficient homes, and for commercial buildings. There's also going to be rebates for whole home energy efficiency upgrades and appliance electrification. Now, these funds are really key for owners because they drive whole home retrofits and electrification. I'll pause right here to say there's gonna be a really strong theme in both of these bills around electrification, and that means appliance electrification, so switching from fossil fuel appliances like gas and propane furnaces to efficient electric heat pumps, electric stoves, or induction stoves. The reason electrification is a key theme in this bill is because historically energy efficiency has and will continue to be a really crucial role in this sector. But electrification both addresses some key health concerns that have been popping up in the climate and energy sector. It also addresses us not investing in more fossil fuels going forward. And then finally, they are efficient and certainly affordable in some spaces. For any heat pump skeptics out there, they do work in Wisconsin. The giant cold snap that we all just experienced over the winter holiday, there are numerous examples of people's heat pumps functioning even in those really cold temperatures. So that is why we're going to see electrification be a key theme in these bills. All right, another opportunity is for state and local engagement. Often we find that federal bills are not engaged enough with local groups, and it's hard for them to be effective when it's the federal government making these decisions. Well, a lot of these grant funds and tax credits and rebate funds actually have a lot of input from the state and local communities, so that's going to be very effective for making sure these funds are effective for local communities. Now, there are risks. Again, some of these funds can be used to invest in appliances that do not meet the state's climate goals, and there is a risk of complicated funding rollout or being difficult for people to access this funding. Regardless, that's the opportunity that we saw with state and local engagement. With effective engagement from the community, we can address these concerns early. Next, we're seeing builders and contractors and the impact on them. There is a ton of money for workforce development in the building sector, both in manufacturing of appliances, but also in contractor training and installation. In addition, for some of these funds, there's direct incentives, so contractors can actually electrify. When they're electrifying homes, they get a kickback so that they have an extra incentive to invest in this. And then there's also prevailing wage incentives in much of the bill. Opportunities here, there's opportunities for electrification-specific training, which, as I said, was a key part of the bill. Also, an effort to diversify an inclusive workforce is really well funded here. Risks, though, is that if these training and workforce programs aren't done effectively, contractors still may be unfamiliar with installing or recommending the appliances that are incentivized in this bill, making the incentives hard to access. Also, there's a risk of shortfall of workers. We need to make sure there is good and enough contractor training out there so that these funds can be used and anyone who wants access to appliances eligible for these funds can get them. But these funds are going to be really huge for Wisconsin, y'all. It's going to spur a lot of efficiency and electrification efforts with, at minimum, $149 million in just the rebates coming to this state. Now, we crunched the numbers and we have an estimate of, for the high efficiency efficiency projects, we're expecting about 84,000 electrification upgrades and 45,000 whole home efficiency upgrades are eligible with the rebates. The tax credits, we're going to see about 250,000 heat pumps eligible in Wisconsin, 22,000 new efficient homes could be built, and 4 million square feet of commercial space retrofitted. I will say the tax credits is an estimate, a really big estimate. The tax credits are uncapped, so if this bill and these tax credits were implemented really effectively in Wisconsin, these numbers could be way higher if that's how Wisconsin is able to implement this. So how are building funds being used? Well, let's start in Wisconsin because the state's already jumping on it. They've already applied for and will be granted $95 million for low-income weatherization. And as I said, the state will be eligible for $149 million in electrification and efficiency funds. Now, our neighbors, what are they doing with it? Well, Illinois and Michigan is already working to boost existing workforce programs with electrification and efficiency training so that contractors are knowledgeable on these programs so that these grants can be accessed. In addition, we're seeing Michigan invest in school geothermal heat pump projects so that we can drive down the operational costs of heating, cooling a building and schools so that they have that money for educational activities. In Pennsylvania, we're seeing more city-level work. So there's efforts they have developed, and there's efforts to blend in federal funding with a city-level whole home retrofit program. And again, a whole home retrofit is doing health and safety upgrades, efficiency upgrades, electrification, and renewable energy so that the buildings are affordable, safe, and healthy to live in, and climate-aligned. Okay, so next we've got Colorado, and again, they're still thinking about this stacking piece of how can we put federal, state, and utility funds together for whole home retrofits, because frankly, one rebate for a low-income community is not enough to put solar on your home or a stove in your house when you're just trying to pay the next bill. Well, being able to stack funds can really drive down upfront costs for communities that need these costs to be decreased. And so that's a real key in Colorado and something that we're seeing a lot of other states consider as well. And then finally in California, they're really looking at the new building sector and streamlining code compliance so that all new buildings are up to standards with state requirements. And the last thing we're going to talk on is the transportation sector. So there's a lot of money coming to the vehicle space in Wisconsin. There are new EVs, used EV funding, heavy duty and transportation vehicles that are getting funding. There's also funding for residential chargers and commercial chargers. For the grants, we're seeing funding for EV manufacturing, for schools, and for local and state governments. Now, there's a really key opportunity here, which is in charging. You know, there's a big range anxiety risk that I think a lot of people have felt when thinking about electric vehicles. And this funding is really going to expand the charging options for people in the state. There also is money to develop an electric vehicle workforce in the state and electrify public transportation so everyone has access to an electric vehicle. Now, the risks are still there. Upfront costs could still remain too high. You know, $7,500 is great, but when you're talking about a new vehicle, that is still a lot of money that you're faced with, and not everyone can afford that. But this also creates an opportunity for both to focus on public transportation, but also for state and local action to supplement these efforts. And then finally, there's still a risk that disadvantaged communities don't benefit. If there's not a focus on the public transportation sector, then there will be groups of people that are left out. But luckily, we're in a place right now where we can still make those decisions and support people. Now let's talk about the EV tax credit overhaul, because I feel like it was a big piece in the news, and a lot of people, it was very confusing about what was eligible, what changed, etc. So I'm going to talk about 3 key pieces that were overhauled in the tax credit. So before the tax credit, over 70% of EV sales were ineligible due to a manufacturing cap, meaning, for example, once Tesla customers had used X number of tax credits, no new Tesla customers were eligible for it. Well, that manufacturing cap is gone. So if the car is eligible to the tax credit, no matter how many people buy that car, the tax credit will still be available. There was also concerns of lack of tax appetite. A lot of people couldn't access this because they weren't paying enough taxes, and therefore a tax credit wasn't actually useful. Well, starting in 2024, there's going to be a point of sale rebate. So this is actually very effective for people because they actually get that $7,500 when they're standing in the car dealership. So you don't need a tax appetite. You also don't need to take out a loan for that $7,500 and then pay it back in April during tax season. And then finally, used vehicles are eligible. Before, most used vehicle sales did not get any funding. Now they will. So let's ask the final question. What are people using EV funding for? Wisconsin's already ahead of the game. It's got 65 electric school buses and 46 electric public buses on the way. And it also has $11 million approved and allocated from the federal government for EV charging funding. Our neighbor Ohio is working on workforce, and in fact, they're investing in new EV charger manufacturing lines. And in North Carolina, we're seeing them work to add jobs to do EV battery plant manufacturing. And then finally in Colorado, we're seeing again investment in new electric public buses. So public buses, charging, and workforce are real key in the transportation sector. And then finally, we're going to hit on some of the key provisions for low-income and environmental justice communities. So for low-income and environmental justice communities, we're seeing a lot of carve-outs for low-income electrification, so home electrification projects. We're seeing money reserved for community-led initiatives that are reflected of the greater energy sector, whether it's transportation, buildings, or electricity, and community-led initiatives to address these problems as these communities see fit. Funding for affordable housing retrofits to make sure that all affordable housing is safe, affordable, and climate aligned. And finally, funding for tribal home upgrades and transportation. So these are some really key call-outs for these communities. Now, the opportunities, again, are there. There's opportunities for local engagement, so the groups that are using these funds and need this money can drive how these funds are used. And there's a clear commitment, renewed commitment to environmental justice partnerships. There are also risks. These funding streams can be used for fossil fuel projects, such as gas appliances, which do have the risk of exacerbating the already disproportionate health impacts local environmental justice communities experience. There's also a risk that these funds cannot be stacked or braided. Well, they won't be stacked or braided, meaning that these projects will have not as low of upfront cost as possible. But again, these risks are manageable. As long as we interface with these projects and these funding sources early, we can make sure that funding is stacked with other funds to make sure that upfront costs are as low as possible, and that we are investing in healthy, climate-aligned projects. So I've talked a lot about what's in here, but what's the timeline? When do we need to be worried about all this stuff? Well, in 2021 and 2022, both of these bills were passed. January 1st of this year, so 26 days ago, the tax credits were activated and that EV manufacturing cap was lifted. So all the tax credits we've talked about today are active for projects that go online today or going forward. In March of this year, we're going to see a lot of the key funding start to flow. So the codes funding, rural funding, and schools funding will begin to flow. Actually, right now, the application process for the schools is already open, and so is the codes and rural funding. In August of next year, those building rebates are going to be active. So they may be active beforehand, but they have to be active by 2024 August per the law. And then finally, the greenhouse gas financing funds. So these are funds in order to finance, low interest funds to finance any project that reduces greenhouse gases will also be active by then. September of 2026, all the environmental justice funds must be spent. And then in December 2031, the tax credits will start to sunset. So these are a couple dates to keep in mind as you're thinking about how you'll want to engage in federal funding. So I'm going to leave us off on this slide. Both of these bills are carrot-based policy. They are not, it's not stick. There's almost no requirements in this bill. So it's all carrot-based policy, which requires effective implementation. Without effective implementation, to be frank, we could spend billions of dollars and literally do nothing. But if we are able to implement this well and use this funding effectively, this money can go far, far farther than we think it can. But here's some key themes we're seeing in all the sectors. For the buildings, stacking funds together, so stacking tax credits on top of rebates, on top of grants, to do comprehensive building retrofits is something a lot of states are looking at. There's also a focus on appliance electrification, as I said in this bill, to make sure that we are pairing energy efficiency and health and safety upgrades with appliance electrification and renewable energy. In the vehicle sector, we're seeing EV charging and addressing that range anxiety concern as a real key talking point. And then also private and public vehicle electrification, especially that public piece to address equity concerns. In the electricity sector, we're really seeing a focus on electric infrastructure investment in disadvantaged communities. And then finally, all across the board, buildings, transportation, electricity, it's all about workforce development. There is a lot of funding for jobs that are both manufacturing and contractor installation within the United States. So with that, thank you. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, but also if it's helpful to email me after, my email address is up there. So thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. There's a lot to wrap your head around with all these funds, and really appreciate you coming in this morning to share with us. I have a few questions on WOBA that are coming in that maybe we could hit really quick. Mm-hmm. The first question is, how soon will the PSC have the rebate program up and running? And maybe you could describe what that means, because I'm not familiar with the rebate program that the PSC will be running.
Yeah, so previously in the building sector slides, we saw that from the Inflation Reduction Act, there are buildings-related rebates. So there's a rebate for energy efficiency projects in the residential sector and for electrification projects or appliance electrification. So there is about $14,000 in funding to replace the appliances in your home with efficient electric ones, and about $5,000 for energy efficiency improvements, which could include also appliance upgrades, but also insulation or weatherization efforts. So basically how this is going to work is that although the Department of Energy has these funds, they will be subgranting them to state energy offices in every single state. Again, Wisconsin has $149 million for both these rebate programs. The Office of Energy Innovation in Wisconsin sits under the Public Service Commission here in Wisconsin, which is actually unique, but it's not that important where it sits, but they sit in the Office of Energy Innovation, and they, which is under the PSC. The rebates have to be active by August 2024, so that will be the latest. Rumor has it from the Department of Energy, which, just to say, like, the DOE will publish these funds when they want to. But rumor has it that the applications, state energy offices can apply for these funds in late summer, early fall is the expectation. From there, the state energy offices will apply for that funding and actually start implementing it. If I had to give you my best guess, I would say sometime in 2024, between January and August. But that's a guess. But yeah, that's the estimate for that. I will say that there will be, so we talked about how it's very important for community engagement. Because it is under the PSC, there actually is a really huge opportunity, which is the PSC will be opening a docket for comments probably in late 2023 that will allow for input on for people to give on how these rebate programs are implemented. So keep an eye out for that if that is something you're interested in.
Thanks for that. It looks like we have a few hands. I'm going to probably alternate with you guys on the WOVA questions. We don't have that much time, but I'll go ahead and pass the mic around, and you guys could ask your questions in the mic.
On those rebates, especially like the $4,000 to $8,000 rebate for heat pumps, are you saying that those will not be available possibly for a year or two? And if they aren't, will the rebates be retroactive? If you were to install a heat pump this year, do you think you would still get the $4,000 to $8,000 point of sale rebate?
Yeah, the rebates will certainly not be active before August of this year, and I would not be surprised if they are not active this year. And no, they are not going to be retroactive. So the point in which you get your rebate is at the time that the appliance is installed, not technically at the point of purchase, if those are two different points. So for efficiency upgrades, if you're doing the electrification rebate, because they're two different ones, they can be point of sale or at the time of installation. But that will be the point of which, if the rebates are active at that point, you get the rebate. Otherwise, you do not.
Yeah, there's a question here on WOVA regarding the 179D credit. It states that the 179D credit isn't set up to be direct pay, so it's more complicated for local governments and nonprofits. Is anyone figuring that out?
Yeah, so they are still working on releasing guidance for 179D. There has been some initial guidance, but there is no official guidance published by the IRS yet. There is a huge advocate community at the national level working to try and make it direct pay, which is basically, if you don't know what direct pay, it allows you to pass through the tax credit if you either don't pay taxes or don't have enough tax appetite. You can pass it through to someone who does, such as the designer, and they will get that tax credit. And then, hopefully there's like a little bit of a kickback so that everyone can share, and anyone in the project will share a little bit in this reduced costs. We're unsure at the moment. The advocate community is unsure of whether there will be direct pay in 179. The official guidance hasn't been published, but there are efforts to advocate for that.
Any questions from the audience? Bill, here you go.
Do we have definition yet of what low-income community is?
Depends on the grant. So it depends on the federal funding stream. So they are pretty much for each individual federal funding stream defining that differently. For the most part, it has been a universal definition designed by the Department of Energy that you can find on their website. I don't have it memorized, but it depends. So like, for example, for the building rebates, it's 80% of area median income or less. For low income and medium income is designed as 150% of area median income or less. That is generally the rule of thumb people are using, but as I said, it is they are defining it for each individual grant, so that might vary depending on the funding stream.
Could you talk a little bit about what municipalities should be on the lookout for regarding the funding opportunities?
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for municipalities. I'll call out a couple, but it really depends on what you're focused on. In the transportation sector, there's a lot of funding available for public transportation, for upgrading charging or adding electric vehicle charging that I would look out for. In the building space, there's a lot of funding for local workforce. So a really key thing in the building sector is driving local workforce and contractor training efforts, because those are the communities and the people that understand what people in their communities need the most, and they understand the housing stock the most. So I think the workforce development programs are something that's going to be really crucial in local communities. And then in the electricity sector, there's a lot of electric infrastructure upgrade funds. And then finally, I'll do one more overarching across all sectors recommendation, which is there is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is a big fund of like $27 billion. It's like a number that doesn't even make sense. It's so big. But it is basically a fund that is going to do low interest financing for projects. And so that's going to be really big for groups or municipalities that are trying to put projects off the ground, and they do have funding available, but they need it in a low interest loan. And it does allow you to kind of remove yourselves from the highly competitive grant sector, which can be really difficult or very unreliable. Where the Greenhouse Gas Financing Fund, which again, August 2024 is when that will be up and running, is going to be really exciting.
All right, thanks. It's 8:17 now. Do we want to wrap up or hit more questions? I know the morning session starts at 8:30, so.
Yeah, we can wrap up now. If anyone has questions, please email me or I will be around. But thank you all for coming today. It was great talking to you.